The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Ouagadougou as President Ibrahim Traoré sat in his office, reviewing a stack of documents that would change the course of African history. The young military leader, barely 34 years old, had been thinking about this decision for months. On his desk lay reports from embassies across Africa, each telling the same story of frustrated travelers, separated families, and missed business opportunities because of visa restrictions. Traoré's own journey to leadership had been unconventional. Born into a modest family in rural Burkina Faso, he had witnessed firsthand how colonial borders continued to divide African people long after independence. His grandmother used to tell him stories of the old days when people moved freely across the land, following trade routes that had existed for centuries. Before European maps carved up the continent, the idea first came to him during a continental summit in Addis Ababa. He had watched as African leaders spoke passionately about unity, while their own citizens needed expensive visas and lengthy paperwork just to visit neighboring countries. A businessman from Senegal had approached him during a break, explaining how visa fees and delays were killing regional trade. The man's frustration was evident as he described missing crucial meetings because of bureaucratic red tape. That evening, Traoré called his closest advisors to his hotel room. Minister of Foreign Affairs Olivier Rwamba initially expressed concerns about security and administrative challenges. The Minister of Interior worried about controlling immigration flows. But Traoré's vision was bigger than these immediate concerns. He spoke about Kwame Nkrumah's dream of a united Africa and how small steps could lead to greater integration. Back in Ouagadougou, the president began consulting with immigration experts, economists, and historians. Dr. Aminata Sawadogo, a professor at the University of Ouagadougou, presented research showing how free movement had historically boosted economic growth in other regions of the world. She pointed to examples from the European Union and ECOWAS protocols that had already proven successful in West Africa, though with limitations. The decision wasn't made overnight. Traoré spent weeks meeting with traditional chiefs, religious leaders, and civil society organizations. Many supported the idea, seeing it as a return to African values of hospitality and brotherhood. Some worried about security risks, pointing to conflicts in neighboring regions. The president listened to every concern, taking notes in his careful handwriting. One particularly moving conversation came from Mamadou Ouedraogo, an elderly trader who had spent his life moving goods between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Despite the existing ECOWAS free movement protocol, he still faced numerous challenges and unofficial fees at border crossings. His weathered face lit up when Traoré explained the new policy would eliminate all visa fees for Africans, not just those from specific economic communities. The technical preparations began immediately. Government IT specialists worked to update computer systems at airports and border crossings. Immigration officers received new training on the simplified procedures. The Ministry of Tourism prepared for a potential influx of visitors, while the Ministry of Commerce studied the economic implications of increased regional trade. International reactions were mixed. Some Western diplomats privately expressed concerns about security implications, while others praised Burkina Faso's leadership in promoting African integration. The African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa took notice, with several member states requesting detailed information about the policy's implementation. As the announcement date approached, Traoré reflected on the broader meaning of this decision. It wasn't just about eliminating visa fees. It was about recognizing that artificial borders shouldn't separate African peoples. He remembered his grandmother's stories and wondered what she would think of this moment. The policy would allow any African citizen to enter Burkina Faso without paying visa fees, though they would still need proper documentation and would be subject to normal immigration procedures. The president's communications team prepared press releases in French, English, Arabic, and several local languages. They wanted every African to understand this message of welcome. Social media strategies were developed to spread the news across the continent, from Cairo to Cape Town, from Dakar to Dar es Salaam. On the eve of the announcement, Traoré walked through the streets of Ouagadougou, observing the bustling markets where traders from across West Africa already conducted business. He imagined how this policy might encourage similar movements of people and ideas throughout the continent. Street vendors selling colorful fabrics from Ghana chatted with customers from Ivory Coast, while musicians from Mali performed for crowds that included people from various African nations. The policy represented more than administrative change. It symbolized a philosophical shift toward viewing Africa as one community, rather than 54 separate entities. Traoré understood that critics would question the timing, given regional security challenges, but he believed that building stronger connections between African peoples would ultimately enhance stability, rather than threaten it. That night, as he reviewed his speech one final time, the young president thought about the letters he had received from Africans living abroad, describing their difficulties visiting family members or conducting business across borders. Tomorrow's announcement would begin to address these challenges, at least for those wanting to visit Burkina Faso. The decision reflected Burkina Faso's growing confidence on the continental stage. Despite being a landlocked nation with limited resources, the country was positioning itself as a leader in African integration. Traoré's government had already made several bold moves since taking power, focusing on sovereignty and self-reliance while maintaining open relationships with African neighbors. As midnight approached, everything was ready for the historic announcement that would echo across Africa and beyond. The first week after the announcement brought immediate and tangible changes to Burkina Faso's borders and airports. At Ouagadougou International Airport, Immigration Officer Marie Kabore noticed the difference right away. Instead of the usual handful of African travelers she processed daily, lines were forming with passengers from countries she had rarely seen represented before. A group of entrepreneurs from Rwanda arrived on a Tuesday morning, their excitement evident as they cleared immigration without paying the visa fees that would have cost them hundreds of dollars. Team leader Jean-Baptiste Uvimana explained to local media that they were exploring investment opportunities in renewable energy projects. Their company had been considering expansion into West Africa for years, but visa costs and complexity had delayed their plans. The ripple effects extended far beyond individual travelers. Within days, several African airlines announced route adjustments and increased capacity to Ouagadougou. Ethiopian Airlines, already well connected across the continent, added extra flights to accommodate growing demand. Smaller regional carriers began exploring new routes that had previously been economically unviable due to limited passenger volumes. Local businesses quickly adapted to serve the increasing number of visitors. Hotels in Ouagadougou reported booking increases of over 300% compared to the same period the previous year. Restaurant owners began hiring additional staff and expanding their menus to include dishes from various African cuisines, recognizing that their customer base was becoming more diverse. The economic impact became visible in unexpected ways. Money exchange bureaus near the airport started stocking currencies they had never handled before, from Botswanan pula to Tanzanian shillings. Taxi drivers began learning basic phrases in Swahili, Arabic, and Portuguese to better serve customers from East, North, and Southern Africa. Dr. Fatima Al-Rashid, an archaeologist from Sudan, arrived to study ancient trade routes that had connected North and West Africa for centuries. Her research had been postponed multiple times due to visa complications and costs. Standing at the archaeological site near Dori, she reflected on how modern policies were finally catching up with historical realities of African interconnectedness. The policy's impact on families was particularly moving. Aisha Traoré, a Malian woman who had married a Burkinabe man 20 years earlier, could finally afford to bring her elderly mother for extended visits. Previously, visa fees had made such trips financially impossible for many families, separated by colonial borders that had divided ethnic groups and communities. Educational exchanges flourished almost immediately. The University of Ouagadougou received applications from students across the continent who could now afford to consider studying in Burkina Faso. Professor Boukari Sawadogo noticed an immediate increase in inquiries about archaeology and anthropology programs from students in East and Southern Africa who brought different perspectives on continental history. Religious tourism also experienced growth. Muslim pilgrims from various countries began including Burkina Faso's historic mosques in their spiritual journeys. The Grand Mosque of Ouagadougou welcomed visitors from as far as Somalia and Mozambique, creating interfaith dialogue opportunities that had been limited by travel costs. However, the rapid changes also brought challenges. Immigration authorities had to quickly adapt their procedures to handle increased volumes while maintaining security standards. Additional staff were recruited and trained to manage longer lines without compromising thoroughness. Computer systems required upgrades to process the variety of African passports and documentation they now encountered daily. Security concerns were addressed proactively. The government worked closely with regional and international partners to enhance information sharing about potential security threats. President Traoré emphasized in interviews that the policy aimed to facilitate legitimate travel while maintaining robust security measures to protect both visitors and citizens. Border communities experienced significant changes as well. The town of Kanchari, near the border with Niger and Benin, saw increased cross-border trade as merchants took advantage of easier movement. Local markets expanded their offerings, and new businesses emerged to serve the growing number of travelers passing through. Medical tourism began emerging as an unexpected sector. Burkina Faso's improving healthcare infrastructure attracted patients from neighboring countries who could now afford to seek treatment without visa fees, adding to their medical expenses. The National Hospital in Ouagadougou reported treating patients from 12 different African countries in the first month after the policy implementation. Cultural exchanges multiplied rapidly. Musicians from across Africa began visiting to collaborate with Burkina Faso's renowned artists. The annual FESPACO Film Festival received unprecedented applications from filmmakers continent-wide, who could now attend without prohibitive visa costs. This created opportunities for authentic African storytelling and cross-cultural artistic collaborations. Agricultural experts from various countries arrived to study Burkina Faso's innovative farming techniques, particularly in areas affected by climate change. Knowledge sharing accelerated as researchers could move more freely to conduct comparative studies and implement successful practices across different regions. The policy also attracted attention from the African diaspora. Second- and third-generation Africans living abroad began planning heritage trips to explore their ancestral continent. Many had been deterred by complex visa requirements, but Burkina Faso's welcoming policy provided an accessible entry point for diaspora tourism. International development organizations took notice of the policy's early success. Several NGOs began relocating their regional headquarters to Ouagadougou, recognizing the advantages of operating from a country that welcomed visitors from across the continent without financial barriers. Youth movements across Africa celebrated the policy as validation of their Pan-African ideals. Student organizations began planning exchange programs and conferences that would have been impossible under previous visa regimes. Young entrepreneurs started networking across borders, forming partnerships that transcended colonial linguistic and administrative divisions. The transformation was most visible in Ouagadougou's city center, where languages from across the continent could be heard in markets, restaurants, and hotels. Local residents adapted quickly, with many expressing pride that their country was leading continental integration efforts. Children in schools began learning about countries they had rarely heard of, as teachers used the increased diversity of visitors as educational opportunities. By the end of the first month, government statistics showed that African visitor arrivals had increased by over 400%. More importantly, the average length of stay had doubled, indicating that visitors were finding value in extended exploration of what Burkina Faso offered. The policy was not just facilitating transit, but encouraging meaningful engagement with the country and its people. 6 months after the implementation, the visa-free policy had triggered a continental conversation about the future of African integration. President Traoré received invitations to speak at the African Union Summit, regional economic community meetings, and academic conferences across the continent. His message was simple but powerful. Artificial barriers between African peoples must be eliminated to unlock the continent's potential. The policy's success had created a domino effect across West Africa. Ghana announced that it would eliminate visa fees for all African citizens by the end of the year. Senegal followed with a similar announcement, specifically citing Burkina Faso's positive experience as evidence that such policies could work without compromising security or overwhelming infrastructure. In Dakar, Senegal, President Macky Sall hosted a regional summit focused on freedom of movement. Attending leaders from 15 countries heard presentations about Burkina Faso's experience, including detailed data on economic benefits, security measures, and administrative adaptations. The summit concluded with the Dakar Declaration, committing participating countries to gradually eliminate visa fees for African travelers. The economic data from Burkina Faso was compelling. GDP growth had increased by 2.3%, directly attributable to increased African tourism and business travel. Tax revenues from the hospitality sector had doubled, while new business registrations had increased by 150%. The multiplier effect was evident as money spent by African visitors circulated through local economies, creating jobs and opportunities in sectors from transportation to handicrafts. International investors took notice of Burkina Faso's growing reputation as a business-friendly destination for African entrepreneurs. A consortium of banks from Nigeria, South Africa, and Morocco announced plans to establish a regional headquarters in Ouagadougou, recognizing the city's emerging role as a hub for continental commerce. This decision prompted other multinational companies to reconsider their African expansion strategies. The demographic changes in major cities were striking. Ouagadougou's population had grown by 8% in 6 months, with the increase entirely attributed to African migrants who chose to stay longer term. These new residents brought diverse skills and perspectives that enriched local communities. Schools hired teachers from different African countries, exposing local children to continental languages and cultures. Cultural festivals evolved to reflect the new diversity. The traditional mask festival in Bobo Dioulasso expanded to include mask-making traditions from across Africa. Artisans from Cameroon, Ivory Coast, and Mali worked alongside local craftspeople to create fusion pieces that celebrated shared African aesthetic traditions while honoring regional differences. The academic world was revolutionized by easier movement of scholars and students. Research collaborations that had been discussed for years finally materialized as visa barriers disappeared. The University of Ouagadougou established partnerships with institutions in Kenya, Egypt, and South Africa, creating exchange programs that allowed students to experience different African educational systems and perspectives. Medical advances accelerated through increased collaboration between healthcare professionals from different countries. A breakthrough in treating river blindness emerged from joint research between Burkina-based scientists and colleagues from Uganda and Nigeria. Traditional medicine practitioners from various countries gathered to document and preserve healing, knowledge that colonial borders had previously kept separate. The technology sector experienced remarkable growth as digital entrepreneurs from across Africa established operations in Burkina Faso. A fintech startup founded by developers from 4 different countries launched a mobile payment system designed specifically for cross-border African transactions. Their success attracted venture capital from African investors who saw the potential for continent-wide solutions. Agriculture continued to benefit from knowledge exchange as farmers adapted techniques from different climate zones and growing conditions. Crop yields improved in drought-prone regions as farmers learned water conservation methods from colleagues in other arid countries. Seed exchanges became common, with varieties adapted to specific conditions being shared across borders. The environmental movement gained momentum as conservationists could more easily coordinate efforts across ecosystems that spanned multiple countries. A joint initiative to protect migratory birds involved researchers from 12 countries who could now collaborate without visa restrictions hindering their movement. Wildlife corridors were established that recognized natural boundaries rather than political ones. Religious tourism flourished, as pilgrims and spiritual seekers could explore the continent's diverse religious heritage more affordably. Burkina Faso's historic mosques became stops on pilgrimage routes that included sites in Mali, Niger, and Morocco. Christian communities established connections with churches across the continent, organizing youth exchanges and theological discussions. The policy's success influenced discussions at international forums beyond Africa. European Union officials privately acknowledged that Burkina Faso's experiment challenged assumptions about the relationship between visa restrictions and security. Some began questioning whether similar policies might benefit European integration efforts. Sports development reached new heights as athletes and coaches could move freely for training and competition. The national basketball team improved dramatically after training with coaches from countries with strong basketball traditions. In return, Burkina Faso cycling expertise was shared, with athletes from mountainous regions who adapted high-altitude training techniques to improve their performance. Women's empowerment accelerated as female entrepreneurs from across Africa established networks and business partnerships. A women's cooperative founded by entrepreneurs from 6 countries became a model for other collaborative ventures. These women shared marketing strategies, product development techniques, and access to continental markets that individual efforts might not have achieved. Language evolution became visible as people adapted to communicate across linguistic barriers. French remained the official language, but public signs in Ouagadougou began including Arabic, English, and Portuguese translations. Local radio stations started programming in multiple African languages, creating truly continental media experiences. The youth demographic showed the most dramatic changes in perspectives and ambitions. Young people who had grown up thinking of Africa in terms of separate countries began seeing the continent as one large opportunity space. Student organizations planned continental tours, while young entrepreneurs developed business plans that assumed easy movement across borders. Innovation accelerated in unexpected areas as diverse perspectives combined to solve common problems. Solar energy solutions developed in Burkina Faso were adapted by engineers from countries with different sun exposure patterns. Water purification techniques were shared between countries facing similar challenges but with different resource availabilities. The cumulative effect was a transformation in how people thought about African identity and possibility. Visitors often commented that Burkina Faso felt more like Africa than their own countries, in the sense that continental diversity was visible and celebrated in daily life. This psychological shift was perhaps the most important long-term impact of the visa policy. By the 6th month, other countries were not just studying Burkina Faso's policy, but actively implementing their own versions. The vision of free movement across Africa, which had seemed utopian just months earlier, was becoming a practical reality that was reshaping the continent's future. 3 months into the new visa policy, the transformative effects had spread throughout Burkina Faso's economy and society in ways that surprised even the most optimistic planners. The Ministry of Commerce reported that cross-border trade had increased by 180%, with new trading relationships forming between Burkinabe businesses and partners from countries they had rarely engaged with before. In the bustling Rue Woko market in Ouagadougou, vendor Salimata Ouedraogo had expanded her textile stall to accommodate fabrics from across the continent. Kenyan kente cloth now hung alongside traditional Burkinabe bogolan, while customers from Somalia examined beadwork created by artisans from Zimbabwe. Her monthly income had tripled as African visitors sought authentic local products to take home. The technology sector experienced unexpected growth. Software developer Ibrahim Compaoré found himself collaborating with programmers from Nigeria, South Africa, and Egypt, who had visited Burkina Faso for conferences and decided to extend their stays. Their informal meetups evolved into a co-working space that attracted digital nomads from across the continent, creating Ouagadougou's first Pan-African tech hub. Healthcare improvements became evident as medical professionals from various African countries arrived to share knowledge and techniques. Dr. Amina Kohn, head of pediatrics at the National Hospital, worked alongside specialists from Morocco and Ghana to develop new treatment protocols for childhood diseases common across the Sahel region. These collaborations led to medical breakthroughs that benefited children throughout West Africa. The agricultural sector saw remarkable innovation as farmers from different climate zones shared adaptive techniques. Kofi Asante, an agricultural engineer from Ghana, spent 6 weeks in rural Burkina Faso teaching drought-resistant farming methods he had developed. Local farmers shared their traditional water conservation techniques, creating hybrid approaches that increased crop yields across participating communities. Educational transformation accelerated as the University of Ouagadougou became increasingly international. Professor Nkem Okafor from Nigeria established the first Pan-African linguistics program, studying how languages evolved and spread across the continent. Students from 22 African countries enrolled in the program, creating a dynamic academic environment that reflected the continent's linguistic diversity. The art scene exploded with creativity as musicians, writers, and visual artists from across Africa converged in Burkina Faso. The annual FESPACO Film Festival had become a year-round celebration of African cinema, with filmmakers establishing permanent studios in Ouagadougou. Local musician Aminata Traoré collaborated with artists from Cape Verde, Tanzania, and Algeria to produce an album that topped charts across multiple African countries. Religious and cultural exchanges deepened understanding between different African communities. The Islamic Cultural Center welcomed scholars from across Muslim Africa, while traditional healers from various countries gathered to share medicinal knowledge that had been passed down through generations. These exchanges preserved and revitalized cultural practices that colonial borders had previously separated. Banking and financial services evolved to accommodate the increased economic activity. Local banks partnered with institutions across Africa to facilitate easier money transfers and investment opportunities. Mobile money services expanded to serve customers from different countries, creating the foundation for a truly Pan-African financial network. The success attracted attention from other African governments. Delegations from Ghana, Rwanda, and Senegal visited Burkina Faso to study the policy's implementation. These fact-finding missions often resulted in bilateral agreements that further facilitated movement and trade between countries. The government of Togo announced plans to implement similar visa-free policies, citing Burkina Faso's success as inspiration. Tourism infrastructure developed rapidly to meet growing demand. New hotels opened in secondary cities like Bobo-Dioulasso and Banfora, while existing establishments upgraded their facilities. Tour guides learned multiple African languages, and new tourism routes were developed to showcase the country's archaeological sites, national parks, and cultural landmarks to increasingly diverse visitors. Women entrepreneurs particularly benefited from the policy changes. Mariam Sanogo, who had run a small catering business, expanded to serve the growing number of international conferences and events. Her success inspired other women to start businesses targeting the diverse African market, from translation services to cultural consultation firms. The environmental sector saw positive developments as conservationists from across Africa collaborated on protecting shared ecosystems. Researchers studying the migration patterns of animals that moved between Burkina Faso and neighboring countries could now coordinate their efforts more effectively, leading to better wildlife protection strategies. Youth engagement reached new levels as young Africans could more easily participate in educational and cultural exchanges. The Young African Leaders Summit, held in Ouagadougou, attracted participants from every African country. These young leaders returned home as ambassadors for African unity, spreading the message that continental integration was possible and beneficial. Sports development flourished as athletes and coaches from various countries shared training techniques and competed in friendly matches. The national football team improved significantly after training with coaches from countries with stronger football traditions, while Burkinabe athletes shared their expertise in cycling and athletics with visitors from across the continent. Innovation hubs emerged in unexpected sectors. Fashion designers from different African countries established workshops in Ouagadougou, combining traditional techniques from various cultures to create new styles that appealed to Pan-African markets. These collaborations resulted in fashion shows that celebrated African creativity while generating significant economic activity. The media industry transformed as journalists from across the continent established bureaus in Ouagadougou to cover West African news. This created a more comprehensive and nuanced media landscape that better reflected African perspectives on continental affairs. Pan-African television programming increased, with shows produced in Burkina Faso reaching audiences from Morocco to Madagascar. Language learning became a popular activity as people realized the advantages of communicating across linguistic barriers. French classes filled with English-speaking visitors, while Portuguese and Arabic language schools opened to serve growing demand. These linguistic exchanges created deeper cultural understanding between different African regions. Research institutions collaborated on projects that had previously been difficult to coordinate due to visa restrictions. Climate change adaptation, renewable energy development, and public health initiatives benefited from easier movement of researchers and sharing of expertise. Burkina Faso became a hub for continental research collaboration. The cumulative effect was a sense of excitement and possibility that permeated society. Citizens expressed pride that their country was leading African integration efforts, while visitors often extended their stays upon discovering the warmth of Burkina Faso hospitality and the opportunities available for meaningful engagement with local communities. By the fourth month, the policy had created momentum that extended far beyond individual travelers to encompass institutional partnerships, economic integration, and cultural renaissance that positioned Burkina Faso as a catalyst for broader African unity. 1 year after the historic announcement, President Traoré stood before the African Union Assembly in Addis Ababa, delivering a speech that would be remembered as a turning point in continental history. Behind him, statistics displayed the remarkable transformation that had occurred in Burkina Faso. Economic growth of 4.2%, creation of 150,000 new jobs, and establishment of business relationships with every African country. The ripple effects had spread far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. 12 African countries had implemented similar visa-free policies for African citizens, creating a network of accessible destinations that was reshaping travel patterns across the continent. The African passport, proposed years earlier but never implemented, suddenly seemed not just possible but inevitable, as practical barriers to movement crumbled. In Ouagadougou, the transformation was visible on every street corner. The city had become truly cosmopolitan, with restaurants serving cuisine from across Africa, shops selling products from every region, and conversations conducted in dozens of languages. Local children grew up multilingual, not through formal education, but through daily interaction with the continental community that now called their city home. The economic indicators told a story of sustained growth and diversification. Manufacturing had increased by 85% as companies established regional production centers to serve African markets. Service industries expanded dramatically, with Ouagadougou becoming a regional hub for consulting, financial services, and technology companies serving continental clients. Educational excellence flourished as the University of Ouagadougou evolved into one of Africa's premier institutions. Students from every African country could afford to study there, creating a dynamic academic environment that produced graduates with continental perspectives and networks. Research output increased tenfold as scholars from different countries collaborated on projects, addressing shared challenges. The cultural renaissance that began with increased visitor flows had matured into a permanent transformation. Ouagadougou hosted the first Pan-African Cultural Festival, featuring artists from every country on the continent. The event was broadcast to over 200 million viewers across Africa, showcasing the diversity and unity that was possible when artificial barriers were removed. Healthcare improvements had international recognition as Burkina Faso became a model for collaborative medical research. The diseases that affected multiple African countries were being addressed through coordinated efforts that drew on expertise from across the continent. Life expectancy had increased and child mortality rates had decreased, significantly due to shared knowledge and resources. Agricultural innovation continued to spread as farmers from different regions adapted successful techniques to their local conditions. Climate change adaptation strategies developed through continental collaboration were being implemented across the Sahel region, improving food security for millions of people. Seed banks established through international cooperation preserved genetic diversity while improving crop resilience. The success had attracted global attention as international organizations studied the Burkina Faso model for potential replication in other regions. The World Bank published a comprehensive report highlighting how the visa policy had catalyzed broader economic and social development, challenging conventional wisdom about immigration controls and economic growth. The conference room at the presidential palace buzzed with anticipation as journalists from across Africa and beyond gathered for what they had been told would be a significant announcement. Television cameras from major networks positioned themselves for the best angles, while radio reporters checked their equipment one final time. Social media influencers live-streamed the pre-announcement atmosphere to thousands of followers waiting online. President Traoré entered the room at exactly 10 a.m., flanked by his key ministers and advisors. His calm demeanor contrasted with the electric energy in the room. Photographers captured every moment as he approached the podium, adjusting the microphone that would carry his words across the continent and around the world. My fellow Africans, he began, his voice steady and clear. Today marks a historic moment in our continent's journey toward unity and integration. Effective immediately, Burkina Faso is eliminating visa fees for all African citizens who wish to visit our country. The room erupted in surprised murmurs and rapid note-taking as journalists processed the magnitude of this announcement. He continued explaining the policy details while cameras rolled. African passport holders would no longer need to pay visa fees when entering Burkina Faso, though they would still need to follow standard immigration procedures and present proper documentation. The policy applied to all 54 African Union member states, making Burkina Faso one of the most accessible countries on the continent for African travelers. Within minutes of the announcement, news alerts were buzzing on phones across Africa. In Lagos, Nigeria, businessman Chinedu Okafor was reviewing quarterly reports when his phone lit up with notifications. As someone who frequently traveled for regional conferences, he immediately understood the significance. His company had been exploring expansion opportunities in West Africa, and visa costs had been a constant expense. In Nairobi, Kenya, university student Amara Hassan was planning her thesis research on traditional music across West Africa. The visa fees for multiple countries had been stretching her limited budget. She grabbed her laptop and began researching flights to Ouagadougou, excited about the possibilities this policy opened for African students and researchers. The announcement sent ripples through diplomatic circles across Africa. In Accra, Ghana, the Minister of Foreign Affairs called an emergency meeting to discuss potential reciprocal policies. Ghanaian officials recognized that Burkina Faso's bold move could pressure other countries to follow suit or risk appearing less welcoming to fellow Africans. Social media platforms exploded with reactions. The hashtag #DollarFreeAfrica movement began trending as people shared their thoughts on the policy. A video went viral showing a Senegalese businessman at Ouagadougou airport expressing his joy at not having to pay visa fees. His genuine emotion resonated with thousands who had faced similar financial burdens when traveling within Africa. Economic analysts immediately began calculating the potential impact. Dr. Kwame Asante, a respected economist at the University of Cape Coast, appeared on several news programs explaining how reduced travel costs could boost regional trade. He cited studies showing that visa restrictions had historically limited business interactions between African countries. Despite their geographical proximity, the tourism industry in Burkina Faso responded enthusiastically. Hotel owners in Ouagadougou and Bobo Dioulasso started preparing for increased bookings. Tour operators began developing new packages specifically targeting African travelers who previously might have chosen destinations with easier entry requirements. The famous Festival of Arts and Culture, held every 2 years, could potentially attract significantly more participants from across the continent. International observers offered mixed reactions. European Union officials, while publicly supportive of African integration, privately questioned whether the policy had been properly planned with adequate security measures. Some Western embassies requested briefings on how the new policy would affect their own visa processes and security cooperation agreements. The African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa issued a statement praising Burkina Faso's leadership while encouraging other member states to consider similar policies. AU Commission chairperson mentioned the decision aligned perfectly with the Continental Body's Agenda 2063, which envisions seamless movement of people across Africa. Regional organizations took notice as well. The Economic Community of West African States had already established free movement protocols for member countries, but Burkina Faso's policy went beyond regional arrangements to welcome all Africans. This broader approach sparked discussions about expanding existing agreements to include the entire continent. Immigration offices in major African cities experienced unusual activity as people inquired about travel to Burkina Faso. In Cairo, Egypt, the Burkina Faso embassy reported a 3-fold increase in information requests within hours of the announcement. Similarly, diplomatic missions in Johannesburg, Casablanca, and Addis Ababa saw spikes in visa inquiries. The business community responded positively. The CEO of a major African airline announced plans to increase flight frequencies to Ouagadougou, anticipating higher demand. Cross-border traders, who form the backbone of informal African economies, celebrated the elimination of one more financial barrier to their activities. Academic institutions across Africa began planning exchange programs and research collaborations. The University of Ouagadougou received inquiries from professors interested in sabbatical opportunities, while students started considering Burkina Faso for study abroad programs that previously seemed financially out of reach. Religious leaders also welcomed the announcement. The head of an Islamic organization in Bamako, Mali, noted how the policy would facilitate religious pilgrimages and interfaith conferences. Christian leaders in Ethiopia expressed similar sentiments about increased opportunities for continental religious gatherings. By evening, international news networks were covering the story globally. CNN International, BBC World Service, and France 24 all featured segments on Burkina Faso's visa policy change. The coverage generally portrayed the decision as a bold step toward African unity, though some reports questioned the practical implications for security and immigration control. The announcement's timing coincided with growing conversations about African identity and unity among the continent's youth. Young professionals who had felt restricted by visa barriers saw the policy as validation of their Pan-African aspirations. Social media groups dedicated to African travel and business networking celebrated the news as a breakthrough moment. As the day ended, President Traoré's office reported that the announcement had reached millions of people across Africa through various media channels. The initial reactions suggested that Burkina Faso had successfully positioned itself at the forefront of practical African integration efforts, moving beyond rhetoric to concrete action that would affect real people's lives.